So one of the biggest shocks to the food system has been the COVID-19 pandemic. So in the UK, the food service sector was shut down, meaning people turned to retail for all their food needs, and when coupled with panic buying, resulted in empty shelves. But this was largely a logistics issue in terms of getting food to where it was needed, as we had stocks from Brexit planning and trade continued. But there have clearly been challenges. There were issues with repurposing food packaged in bulk for the service sector, so it could be sold in shops. Some of that food went to waste, though some producers innovated and managed to sell directly to consumers. Some of that food went to food banks, which were in high demand because incomes had dropped. During lockdown, food purchases shifted from fresh foods to non-perishable foods, as people were shopping less frequently and buying in bulk. Some of these foods were high in fat, sugar and salt, and it's very possible that unhealthy eating habits developed during lockdown have now continued afterwards. So there's a possible health issue there. In developing countries, food systems are generally more reliant on labour, and illness led to challenges in terms of harvesting and getting food to market, and a huge rise in hunger. Overall, things could have been a lot worse, and there were two things I think lessened the impacts. Firstly, food workers were designated key workers, so the food system continued to operate. And secondly, borders largely remained open, so trade could continue. The big question, though, for me is how do we build back better post-COVID-19? And we held a GFS BBSLC workshop on that topic, invited lots of stakeholders to that, and produced this report, which is available on our website. Let's talk a little bit about some of the findings. And these findings clearly touch on future research considerations, and I would just say that this is just early UKRI thinking, rather than programmes that are about to emerge. And I'd welcome thoughts on these things as well. So I think there are three things that we need to consider for future research. Firstly, COVID-19 was the latest in a series of shocks to hit the food system. These aren't one-off events and will likely continue into the future. Secondly, we need to consider where a shock hits the food system. COVID-19 was a demand shock, in that the service sector was shut down and demand switched to retail overnight. The next big shock could easily be a climate-related production shock, and that will play out very differently to a demand shock, and I think I've illustrated some of that in my talk so far. And then thirdly, we need to consider the type of shock, and there are many. For example, climate change, geopolitics, trade, labour, food safety, plant and animal disease, biodiversity decline, the list goes on and on. I think importantly though, these shocks are unlikely to occur on their own, and we need to think about the potential for cascading risks. For example, how might a plant disease interact with widespread flooding? And so a key question for research is, how do we make the food system resilient to multiple shocks? There are many ways, but I'll just highlight a couple of these now. So firstly, building slack into the system through functional redundancy, for example, by increasing food storage, so we have reserves in the event of a shock. Secondly, diversification, in terms of food product supplies and geographies, to hedge your bets, so that shock does happen, it only hits one part of your portfolio. This might include diversifying crops and livestock, but I think it equally has to include manufacturing, retail and consumption, and diversification across the patch. Our just-in-time food system, where food is produced, processed, distributed and consumed as it's needed, is highly efficient, but does not always cope well with shocks, especially given its reliance on predictable behaviour. Bringing in redundancy and diversification could help with that, but it would mean lower efficiency and higher costs. So a key question is who pays for that? And what are alternative models of our food system that are both fair and just for everyone? Clearly all of this needs to be framed in terms of the FSR resilience questions, and they're a key part of our thinking in terms of resilience of what, to what, for whom, over what time period. Very useful piece of thinking that's done by this programme. So just on current opportunities, so one of the big areas for UKRI at the moment is net zero, and that's the focus of this network, this £4 million network on research for sustainable agri-food for net zero. And the focus here is how to achieve net zero, but in the context of wider sustainability challenges, and also working across different disciplines and taking this food systems approach. The network also includes funding for feasibility research studies, so it's not just for networking, it's also for doing a bit of research and priming the community for future opportunities in this area. But I just want to make a point, you don't have to wait for a funding opportunity to come up specifically in this area, as UKRI welcomes projects, research proposals at any point through responsive mode, and we have the cross-council remit agreement where you can submit an interdisciplinary research proposal to a lead council who will then work with other councils on peer review and co-funding for that project. So at any point you can put in a proposal. And then finally there's the Transforming UK Food Systems SPF programme, which was also led by GFS and which I'm SRO for. I'm not going to say more about that because we have Guy Poppy talking later on, and I'm sure he will talk extensively about our programme, but just to say that there are loads of opportunities to engage, so I would highly encourage you to do that. My final slide, so back to the FSR programme, because that's what we're here to talk about. So we established there was a need to fund more research in this area, particularly on food system resilience. And so GFS brought together the key funders to develop a single interdisciplinary research programme tackling this issue. There were some key principles that we used to design the programme, and we actually learned quite a lot from the RELU programme, which some of you may have come across. Lots of lessons learned there, fantastic evaluation, which goes through some of those things. But just to highlight some of the key principles. So a food systems approach, I've already talked about, and this need to think holistically and avoid unintended consequences. Genuine integration across disciplines. In particular, this was also learning from RELU, we're keen to avoid bolt-on social science, and this kind of thinking in an interdisciplinary way, bringing in different disciplinary perspectives and findings so that feed into one another. So constant reiteration of those feedback. So there's the co-design of research with stakeholders. In particular, that's to maximise the potential for knowledge exchange and impact. But crucially, we were keen to involve stakeholders throughout the research process. That was one of the key principles, not just at the end, which some projects had done before. And then co-design of the calls, the funding calls across UKRI councils, but also with government and devolved administrations, to ensure we tackled both the shorter policy priorities, but also the longer-term research needs. And last but not least, absolutely not least, a dedicated coordination team to bring together the findings and drive them into policy and practice. I'll stop there by saying I look forward to celebrating the outputs and outcomes of the FSR programme over the next couple of days, and then the third day when it happens, the OCD day. I'll stop there. I wish you an enjoyable